name is Pamela Kunz, and I'm an associate professor of medicine in the Division of Oncology at Yale School of Medicine. It is my great pleasure to speak to you today about NET research, what's on the horizon. These are my disclosures. And I will give, over the course of this 15-minute talk, a brief outline of clinical trial facts, the life cycle of a clinical trial from lab to FDA approval. We will talk about some new NET treatments that will hopefully not have been covered in earlier talks, and then how you can find a clinical trial. I'd like to start with this timeline of recent advances, not to go through each of these, but really just to highlight the fact that we've had an explosion of new discoveries over the last decade, since 2011, and all of these had to go through the clinical trial process. So I want you to keep that in mind, that both the imaging modalities up on the top and the treatments on the bottom had to go through this clinical trial process and FDA approval, and we'll speak about that a little bit. So why are clinical trials so important? They are really a key research tool for advancing medical knowledge and patient care. And clinical research is done to learn two things: whether a new approach is safe and effective, and which treatments or strategies work best for certain illnesses or groups of people. Yet only 8% of US adults with cancer participate in clinical trials. And there are, of course, many barriers to those, but I hope to really explain clinical trials today and debunk some of the myths. So let's talk first about some facts about clinical trials. So clinical trials are not necessarily proven to be better than standard treatment. So I think we have a lot of hope about clinical trials, and I think that's valid. But if you are weighing options between a standard therapy and clinical trials, that's a conversation to have with your oncologist. Clinical trials are not just for patients without other options. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about a clinical trial that is given in the postoperative setting. So there are clinical trials for many different settings of disease. And you will not unknowingly get a sugar pill or placebo. I think that's a fear of a lot of patients. We, as clinical trialists and as doctors offering clinical trials, go over whether or not a placebo is involved in a clinical trial. You will be told what your sort of risk is of being randomized to that placebo, but that's explained in the course of an informed consent. If you decide to participate, you can change your mind later, and you cannot directly compare one results of a trial to another. And then lastly, some standard of care costs may still apply. So visit copays, some labs, if they're considered part of standard of care, they may go through your regular insurance. So let's talk just briefly on phases of clinical trials. So first, there are preclinical studies. These are determining if they work in mouse tumors or in test tubes. Phase 1 trials test safety. This is often any type of tumor eligible, and usually 15 to 25 patients. A small study determines side effects and the best dose. Phase 2 trials are a preliminary test of efficacy. So early hints at, is this drug or combination of drugs effective? It's usually limited to a specific tumor type, also a fairly small study. And then the phase 3 studies are those that are definitive, usually test efficacy compared to a standard treatment, is limited to a specific tumor type like a neuroendocrine tumor. Sometimes there is a placebo. These are often much larger, 200 to 500 patients, and is essential to assess survival differences. And it's usually comparing one treatment to another. And then phase 4 is often one we even forget about, but this tests long-term safety after FDA approval. I'd like to next talk about sponsors for clinical trials, i.e. who pays for these studies. And as someone who leads a large clinical trial portfolio, I try to have all 3 of these different types of sponsored trials in my portfolio. As a patient, it impacts you less, but I think it's still useful for you to know about the sponsors. So they are investigator-initiated, industry-initiated, and National Clinical Trials Network. The investigator-initiated studies are often smaller, usually available only at a single institution. The idea is initiated by an academic doctor, and the funding could be from that institution, philanthropy, and/or a pharmaceutical company. Industry-initiated trials could be phase 1, 2, or 3, involves many sites, sometimes international. The idea is initiated by that company and the funding comes from that company. National Clinical Trial Network trials are also all phases sponsored by the National Cancer Institute, open at centers participating in a National Clinical Trial Network group. So for example, ECOG-ACRIN, SWOG Alliance, and that funding is federal. The clinical trial regulatory pathway, I think, is worth going over. It's a long road to bring a drug from basic research to FDA approval. It takes about 10 years to go through this entire process. So I want you to think about this as a funnel. So that green funnel in the middle are the potential new medicines. They go through basic research, drug discovery, preclinical studies, meaning in mice or in the test tube, and then an investigational new drug application is submitted to the FDA to begin the clinical trial work. The clinical trials, as you've just learned, happen sequentially. Each drug has to go through each of those phases. So remember, safety is determined, then preliminary effectiveness, and then a pivotal RCT or randomized controlled trial. And as you can see, that funnel is slowly narrowing. So if a drug is deemed unsafe, it may not move from phase 1 to phase 2. And if at the phase 2 point it's deemed ineffective, it won't move to phase 3. Then, if it passes all of those steps, then a new drug application is submitted. The FDA reviews that, and then it can finally achieve FDA approval, and then it moves into that post-approval research and monitoring. So when a phase 3 trial is completed and that new drug application is submitted to the FDA, they take into consideration data from all of those different sources, preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. They look at proposed labeling. That means what's the indication for treatment? So what stage of disease? Is it after surgery or is it for patients with metastatic disease? They look at safety, patent information, IRB compliance information, and directions for use. The FDA review team then checks for completeness. They have 6 to 10 months to make a decision. That timeline is called the Prescription Drug Use Free Act, or PDUFA date. And there is a review by a group of team members. And if approved, the FDA assists with refining the indications. And then post-market safety monitoring continues for many months. So if we think about what we currently have available for NET patients, each one of these has gone through that entire lengthy process. So we had pancreas and small bowel NET. This is for lung NET. These algorithms are adopted from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network algorithm that many physicians use to determine what are the appropriate algorithms for treatment. I'd like to bring up a drug that is not on this list, but has actually been through phase 3 trials. It's called surufatinib. I'll remind you that anything that ends in an IB is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. So we already have sunitinib or Sutent approved for pancreatic NETs. So surufatinib has been studied in 2 large phase 3 trials in China. So SANET-P, which was a phase 3 study of 172 patients with advanced well-differentiated pancreatic NETs, were randomized to receive surufatinib or placebo. And the take home from this slide, if you can see on these curves, the surufatinib arm is in blue and the placebo arm is in red. Separation of the curves is good. So on the left is the time it took for patients to have progression, so progression-free survival. And the figure on the right is overall survival. So with that blue line on top and a separation of the curves, that shows that there's benefit from the surufatinib. So specifically, surufatinib had a 10.9 month median progression-free survival compared to 3.7 months for placebo. The response rate or shrinkage rate was 19% for surufatinib versus placebo. Common adverse events or side effects were high blood pressure, protein in the urine, high triglycerides in the blood, and some diarrhea. I want to make another key take-home point from this is that the little target that you see in the top right corner, those indicate what targets this drug hits. And this has a unique angioimmune mechanism. So it targets both the immune system and the blood vessel system, or the vascular endothelial growth factor. The second phase 3 study was in extrapancreatic NETs. And this was also conducted in China. The progression-free survival and overall survival were both longer for surufatinib. The response rate was a little bit lower for extrapancreatic NETs, so that shrinkage rate 10% versus 0%, and the side effects were about the same. So this was for extrapancreatic NETs. Surufatinib was approved by China's National Medical Products Administration, that's the equivalent of their FDA, in December of 2020. So what's happening in the US? Well, a phase 1/2 study was conducted in the United States very recently. So this means they tested safety and early efficacy in 32 patients with NETs. There were no new safety signals. We also saw a 19% response rate in pancreatic NETs, no shrinkage in extrapancreatic NETs, but that disease control rate, ability to slow down the growth, was 100% in those 32 patients. So it meant that it was effective at slowing down the growth of these cancers. The median progression-free survival was not yet available. So what this company then did is they went to the United States FDA. They have submitted a new drug application on the basis of the phase 3 trials conducted in China and the phase 1/2 studies conducted in the United States. So that submission has just been completed a couple of weeks ago. So I mentioned this novel angioimmune mechanism. I think this is really unique to this drug. This is different than sunitinib. The CSF signaling pathway, that's colony stimulating factor, is one of the unique mechanisms, and it promotes infiltration of something called tumor-associated macrophages, which is part of the immune system. And that combination and targeting the blood vessel system may help it be uniquely effective. So some tips on tyrosine kinase inhibitors, that surufatinib is part of this class, including sunitinib. And I think that they have some unique side effects that are worth mentioning: diarrhea, nausea, fatigue, vomiting, hand-foot syndrome, and high blood pressure. And the most common grade 3/4 adverse events are low neutrophils and high blood pressure. And we can do some dose reductions to help make these more tolerable. And I think it's really critical that we partner with specialists. And I have some examples here on the right of partnering with gastroenterologists, cardio-oncology, or cardiologists who specialize in heart side effects from some of these medications. Dermato-oncology is also a new specialty to help deal with skin side effects of some of these medications as well. I'd like to just briefly mention the National Clinical Trials Network. There are 6, as you can see here, National Clinical Trial Network groups. They all work collaboratively. And I bring this up because we actually just had a National Cancer Institute Neuroendocrine Tumor Clinical Trial Planning meeting led by myself, Dr. Simran Singh, who is a medical oncologist in Canada, and Dr. Tom Hope, who's a nuclear medicine specialist in Northern California at UCSF. And this clinical trial planning meeting was entitled Treatment in the Era of PRRT. It was held in March, and its purpose was to help us think about the next generation of clinical trials, given that PRRT has really changed the landscape, with the goals of evaluating potential strategies for enhancing the efficacy of PRRT, developing clinical trials that capitalize on the stress cooperative network, and developing trial designs to evaluate the optimal sequence and timing of PRRT in GEP-NET relative to other therapies. I'd like to spend the last few minutes going over key NET clinical trials to leave you with some hope about the future for NET research. There are a number of trials here. It's a bit of a busy slide, and I'll take you through these step by step. So the first row is a large national clinical trial network, or the NCTN clinical trial, that's in well-differentiated pancreatic NET and GI and lung NET. It's called the CABINET study. It's been open for a little while. It's cabozantinib versus placebo. So this is another one of those tyrosine kinase inhibitors. It's a large study, and we have about a quarter of the patients accrued already. We have a new clinical trial, the next row, for paraganglioma and pheochromocytoma. That's temozolomide plus or minus olaparib, which is a PARP inhibitor. The next row is the RET-NET study. This is a study looking at bland embolization versus lapiodal embolization. So looking at different forms of liver embolization for patients with NETs. The NETTER-2 clinical trial is a first-line trial of Lutathera, or 177 ludotatate. and in a slightly higher Ki-67, so grade 2 and grade 3 up to Ki-67 of 55%. And then the COMPETE trial looks at grade 1 and 2 GEP-NETs and is a randomized study of 177-Lu edotrietide, which is similar to ludotatate, versus everolimus. So all of these are currently open and accruing. This next list are soon to open studies, and we're really excited. These all are coming out of the National Clinical Trial Network, and they really represent new studies in diseases that have not been studied before. So the first is in LACNET, so it's a ludotatate versus everolimus study. The second study is looking at extrapulmonary, so outside the lungs, small cell neuroendocrine carcinomas. In that third row is our first adjuvant study, so looking at patients who've had a pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor surgically removed and giving them CAPE-10 versus observation. And then that fourth row is in well-differentiated grade 1 through 3 pancreatic NET and comparing ludotatate versus CAPE-10. So all really practical, important questions in the field. So how can you learn about clinical trials? I would say the first point is your oncologist and a NET specialist should be your primary guide. So ask them about what clinical trials they may have available locally and certainly in your geographic region. Your institution and cancer center websites are also a great resource. I've listed some local to LA. I do know that patients will be watching who don't live in LA, but these are just some examples. And they often have search fields where you can put in the name of your disease and specific criteria to see if there are clinical trials that might be suited for you. The clinicaltrials.gov website, I will caution, is a bit cumbersome to use, but there are some features where you can, again, select specific diseases and select which studies are open. I'll give you an example here that I did a search and found close to, 600 studies that are open for neuroendocrine tumors and actively recruiting. So take-home points I want to leave you with are that we've made many advances in the last 10 years in terms of treatment and imaging. All of these are due to successful clinical trials and to patients who were willing to enroll on them and our clinical trial researchers and clinical trial coordinators and these huge teams that can make this happen. Clinical trials are critical to make progress in NET treatment, and I think really are reason to be hopeful. I envision the next decade of clinical trials to involve novel forms of PRRT, ways to make PRRT more effective and safe, immunotherapy, and personalized therapies. And I think these will all be incorporated in future trials. And I'd like to thank patients who are listening who have been clinical trial participants. And I think if you are personally interested in clinical trials, I really encourage you to learn more and ask your treating team about them. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you today about this topic, and I look forward to the panel discussion.